Hello and welcome to Unit 5 in our Modern Latin American History class. As you can read here in the block above, this unit will be discussing the period of revolution in the mid-20th century in Latin America. The way that this time frame is outlined in the Chastain book, we'll begin by talking about populism. So keep in mind and maybe take a few notes on what populism is, who the key populist leaders were, such as Juan Perón and Getulio Vargas in Argentina and in Brazil, respectively. Thinking about Peronismo or Peronism will help us to understand a little bit about at least the background section given at the very beginning of The Little School by Alicia Partnoy. And then beginning with the revolutionary movements, the archetypical example from Latin America is the Cuban Revolution because it was so influential as a model for the rest of the region, but also because Ernesto Che Guevara, who had been present in Guatemala in 1954 when the Arbenz administration was overthrown by Operation PB Success, which had the backing of the CIA. Guevara, he saw what had happened there. He saw the methods that were used by the American-backed forces. He saw the ways that the United States drove its anti-communist Cold War agenda in Guatemala and also supported the United Fruit Company there. United Fruit was stood to lose out because of some of the land reform policies of the Arbenz administration that aimed at putting Guatemalan land and resources back in the hands of Guatemalans rather than in foreign interests. So all of these different things came together, and you'll get a little bit of a sense of this in Chastain, what happened in Guatemala, and in the short 10 years of spring video that is included in this unit as well. So the reason, again, I bring up Guatemala is to talk a little bit about Cuba. After the experience in Guatemala as an observer, Che Guevara met Raul and Fidel Castro, and he went with them from Mexico. They were exiled there back to Cuba to foment a revolution against the Batista regime, which had been backed by the United States. And so because of his experience in Guatemala, Che was able to kind of alert the Cuban revolutionaries to the types of methods that were going to be used by U.S.-backed forces in Cuba to try to unseat their new government after it had come to power on January 1st of 1959. Raul and Che were always pretty dedicated Marxists. Fidel, less so. However, he became very dedicated to Marxism by about 1961-62, in a certain sense because there were very few other options in terms of trade partners or external support for the Cuban economy because the United States had issued an embargo against the Cuban government and had and tightened the embargo even more and more once the turn to communism began. But by putting trade restrictions, very heavy ones, on Cuba because of Fidel's moves toward the nationalization of various industries, and again, the notion which goes back to what we were looking at with nationalism is Cuba for Cubans, all of these nations for the people who live in them rather than for multinational corporations or outside foreign interests. So again, the Cuban Revolution was able to stand as this example of a successful yet militant Marxist revolution in Latin America. And U.S. leaders worried that, or at least U.S. policymakers worried that this type of thing would spread throughout the region. They saw it in the bipolar terms of the Cold War, but also in terms of the multinational corporations that I've been mentioning. This period of revolution, important to keep in mind because it, as always, not as black and white as it was made out to be. in the public discourse in the United States and elsewhere. Um, for example, Arbenz in Guatemala in the 1950s was not the ardent communist that he was made out to be, although he had leanings toward a kind of socialist democracy. Um, this idea that democracy and communism were mutually exclusive was a major part of Cold War rhetoric. It was something that, again, U.S. policymakers couldn't see, or at least the way that they cast these terms to the public, couldn't see these things existing together. Communism was a threat to democracy and to the quote-unquote free world. Yet in the process of trying to root out democracy, root out democracy, I guess that's what happened, root out communism in Latin America, many democratic regimes or administrations were forcibly removed with the support of the United States in one way or another. I mentioned in the written intro, the case of Chile is also important to help us bridge from this unit to the last one, because Chile was a clear example that a Marxist administration could come to power through democratic means. That was what Salvador Allende did. Through Chile's longer history of, whether corrupt or not, stable elections and relatively stable democratic institutions, he used those things to win election and then worked with the legislature in Santiago to try to rewrite the Constitution to allow for more socialist and Marxist policies to be part of national law. This was something that the United States couldn't stand for, backed the coup that was led by Augusto Pinochet in 1973. And again, we'll be reading about both of these cases, the Allende election and then the overthrow and the turn to repressive regimes over the course of the next two units. One other thing to point out is that although much of this kind of conflict that I've just been outlining in terms of revolution, in terms of U.S.-backed interference throughout Latin America that was connected to the Cold War and otherwise, a lot of nations like Mexico, for example, were seen as sort of missing a lot of this kind of activity. However, Nellie Blacker's article, Cold War in the Countryside, will help us to understand the ways in which these kinds of trends also impacted Mexico, especially in the southern rural state of Guerrero, where the disappearance of 43 normalistas just a few months ago from the Ayotzinapa school took place. So Blacker did research in Ayotzinapa well before that event had taken place. And so it gives us some context that connects Mexico to this larger history of these social revolutions, and also helps us understand some of the issues that are presently taking place in southern Mexico. One last comment is from the introduction to the Wood readings in chapter 9 on the social revolutions. He gives some pretty good analogies to help us understand what a revolution is and what makes something a social revolution. So that's also something to take notes on and to keep in mind throughout the unit. All right, I will be done there, and I hope that you enjoy.